In the early 1970s, the Cold War was in full swing, and Europe was struggling with its identity on the global stage. Amid this turmoil, US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger tried to strengthen ties with Europe, but found himself frustrated by conflicting voices. He famously asked, "Who do I call when I want to call Europe?" Kissinger's remark highlighted a key issue. While he could easily contact leaders like the US President or the UK Prime Minister, Europe lacked a single figure to represent its diverse interests. Kissinger's question hit the nail on the head. Who exactly is in charge of Europe? This issue hasn't disappeared. In fact, it's only become more complicated. Today, if you want to call Europe, you'd have a list of numbers to choose from. There are 4 presidents in the EU, each with a different job. You could ring up the president of the European Commission, who handles the day-to-day operations, or the president of the European Council, who represents the member states. Maybe you try the president of the European Parliament, who represents the people. Or for an extra twist, there's the rotating presidency, held by a different country every 6 months. To further complicate matters, there's also the executive vice president for foreign affairs, responsible for Europe's foreign policy. And of course, there are still the 27 heads of state, each with their own national priorities. It's no wonder the question still lingers. Who really speaks for Europe? And this leads us to one of the core issues of the EU. No one gets it. Simply put, the European Union is a labyrinth of bureaucracy that even seasoned politicians struggle to navigate. Let's take lawmaking, for instance. The European Commission, one of those many presidents, proposes new laws. Seems straightforward, right? But then the European Parliament gets its hands on the proposal, amending it and debating it. And once they've made changes, it moves to the Council of the EU for more amendments and votes. And don't get it mixed up, because this isn't the same as the European Council, or the Council of Europe for that matter. Those are completely different institutions with different roles. Confused yet? Yes, so is everyone else. And it's not just about the complexity, it's also about the speed. The EU often feels like a bureaucratic monster that moves with the pace of a glacier. There are logistical and administrative hurdles at every turn. Every single document and parliamentary debate needs to be translated into 24 official languages. Yes, 24. The sheer scale of this process is staggering, with over 60,000 people employed across the various EU institutions just to keep things running. And let's not forget the bizarre tradition where once a month the entire European Parliament packs up and moves from Brussels to Strasbourg for a week of plenary sessions, only to return to Brussels afterward. This ritual alone costs the EU nearly 114 million euros annually, burning time, energy, and resources in the process. But the real bottleneck isn't the logistics, it's the diverging interests of 27 member states that make it so difficult to agree on anything. Take migration as an example. Since 2016, the EU has been trying to pass comprehensive legislation to manage its borders and fairly redistribute asylum seekers across the continent. 8 years later, yes, 8 years, and they finally reached a deal. And yet despite the time it took, it's a deal that no one seems to like. Some countries think it's too harsh, others too lenient, and in the end, it feels more like a compromise cobbled together just to move forward, rather than a solution that anyone is truly happy with. And people across Europe are taking notice. This growing frustration is also reflected in the European election turnouts. Over the last 20 years, voter participation has lingered around 50%, often dipping even lower. Compare that to national elections, where turnout usually surpasses 70%, and it's clear that citizens aren't feeling connected to the EU. For an institution representing nearly 500 million people, this level of engagement is alarmingly low. And this leads to yet another core issue of the EU. Is it even democratic? Sure, you have a vote, but with a 50% turnout, only half the Europeans are actually represented in the system. But the problem runs deeper than that. Yes, we elect members of the European Parliament, but the power they hold is more limited than most people realize. If your local MEP promises to tackle rising house prices or address homelessness, there's one big catch. They don't actually have the power to initiate legislation. In fact, they cannot propose new laws at all. That power lies almost exclusively with the European Commission, an unelected body that holds the keys to shaping Europe's laws. The Commission has the sole right to propose legislation, which means your MEP is essentially waiting and hoping that the Commission decides to act on the issues they promise to address. So even if your MEP wants to fight for your local concerns, they're at the mercy of what the Commission chooses to prioritize. And here's what makes things even worse. The European Commission itself is not elected. That's right, unlike your national government, you have no direct say in who sits in the Commission or who becomes the Commission president. Those decisions are made behind closed doors by the 27 heads of state across Europe, not by citizens. Then there's transparency, or more accurately, the lack of it. This has been a recurring issue in the EU, and the COVID-19 vaccine procurement debacle is a recent example. In 2020, as the European Commission took charge of negotiating vaccine contracts on behalf of all member states, much of the process was kept hidden from the public view. Key details such as pricing, delivery schedules, and liability clauses were classified, with even MEPs and national governments struggling to access information. Only a few selected representatives were allowed to view heavily redacted versions of the contracts, locked away in secure rooms. When vaccine deliveries were delayed and Europe's rollout lagged behind countries like the US and UK, public outrage grew. Citizens and leaders alike were left asking why decisions were made in the dark, and the lack of transparency only deepened their frustration. So with all of these problems laid out, should we just get rid of it all? Dexit, Nexit, Frexit, and the rest. It's tempting to think that dismantling the European Union would solve the issues. But let's go back to Kissinger's question. Who do I call when I want to call Europe? If we remove the EU, this question becomes even more difficult to answer. The EU, for all of its flaws, tries to provide a more unified voice for Europe on the global stage. Without it, Europe would splinter into 27 different voices, each trying to shout over the other, and none of them being heard. The United States, China, and Russia. These are nations that speak with one voice, and without the EU, Europe risks of being drowned out in the global conversation. Can Sweden save climate change alone? Can Latvia defend itself alone? Can Italy manage migration by themselves? Or can Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe, negotiate favorable trade deals alone with China or the US, which are more than 10 times Germany's size? The answer is most likely no. Europe's power lies in its ability to act collectively. Without working together, we lose any meaningful influence in the world. That said, it's clear the EU needs to reform. To address the complexity, we need to simplify the EU's institutions so that citizens and politicians alike can understand and navigate them. To address the sluggish pace of decision-making, we need to rethink the veto vote, which often slows us down to a crawl. To address the democratic deficit, we need to empower the European Parliament, the body that is directly elected by the people. And to address transparency, the EU must open its doors wider, with more visibility and accountability in both the European Commission and the Council of the EU. But what do you think? Are you in favor of reforming the EU? If so, check out this video, because here we investigate all the potential changes that could reshape the Union. Or if you're curious in seeing the other side of the coin, with all the positive things the EU has done, check out this video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you want to support us even more, consider joining us on Patreon. Until next time.